The soldiers stood in the dimly lit room, their eyes filled with curiosity. They had all heard the rumors about the mysterious alien war hero. He wasn't like the other soldiers. They had trained for battle their whole lives. But this hero, he was different. He had been to a world so dangerous that even the bravest soldiers trembled at the thought of it. And now he was standing before them, ready to tell this story. The room was silent, filled with anticipation. The soldiers had no idea what to expect. Some of them had heard the whispers, the stories of battles with monsters bigger than buildings and creatures that could tear through steel with their bare claws. Others had heard of his escape from a planet where nothing lived to tell the tale. But whatever the stories were, nothing could prepare them for the truth. The war hero was tall, his eyes hard and cold, as if the very weight of his past had settled deep within them. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each soldier. His expression was serious, but there was something in his gaze that made the soldiers uneasy. It was the kind of look that told you that whatever he was about to say would change everything. "Do you know what it's like to fight for your life every day?" The hero asked in a deep voice that echoed through the room. He paused, waiting for an answer that would never come. The soldiers, stunned by his question, could only stare at him in silence. None of them had experienced a battle like the one he was about to describe. The hero took a deep breath and began speaking. "The world I fought on was a hell like no other. We didn't fight for honor, or glory, or even for a cause. We fought to survive. And every day was a battle." The soldiers leaned forward, hanging on every word. It was hard to imagine a world so dangerous that survival was the only goal. After all, they had trained their entire lives to fight. But to hear that there were places where just staying alive was the greatest victory, that was a reality none of them had ever truly grasped. The hero's voice softened as he spoke of the planet he had been sent to. It wasn't just a place. It was a living nightmare. The land was deadly, and the creatures, they were even worse. His eyes darkened, and for a moment, it seemed as though he had traveled back in time to that hellish world. The soldiers could feel the weight of his words, but they could not yet understand the terror he had faced. He continued, painting a picture of a planet where everything was out to kill you. The air itself was thick and poisonous, and the ground trembled with the steps of creatures that roamed the planet. Monsters larger than any the soldiers had ever encountered existed on this world. Their claws could rip through metal like paper, and their roars could shake the very ground beneath your feet. "At first, we didn't know what we were up against," the hero admitted. "We were soldiers, trained for everything. But nothing could have prepared us for that world. We had to learn fast. The first day we landed, we lost 3 men. No one had ever seen anything like the beasts we faced." The soldiers exchanged looks. 3 men lost on the first day. It was hard to imagine such a fate. They had all faced danger before, but nothing that sounded so relentless. Every soldier in the room began to wonder, how could anyone survive in a world like that? The hero's voice grew colder as he spoke of the first battle. "We had no choice but to fight. The creatures were relentless, attacking from every direction. The only thing we could do was fight back or die trying." His words echoed in the soldiers' minds. They had fought in many wars, but nothing had ever seemed so brutal, so unforgiving. The hero paused and let his words sink in. He looked at the soldiers, his gaze unwavering. "But that's not what makes me a hero," he said finally. "What makes me a hero is that I kept fighting. And I never stopped. No matter what the world threw at me, I survived. And I will tell you this, the moment you stop fighting is the moment you lose." The room was still. The soldiers were stunned, their minds racing with the stories they had just heard. They had expected a simple story of battles and victory, but what the hero had described was something far beyond anything they had ever faced. The hero's words were a warning, a reminder that no matter how prepared you are, life can always throw something worse your way. And the only way to survive is to keep going, to fight. As he finished his story, the hero gave the soldiers one last look. Surviving that world wasn't about strength or weapons, he said. It was about willpower. The strongest weapon you have is your will to survive. And that's the only thing that got me through. The soldiers were left in stunned silence. No one had ever told them a story like this before. And as they stood there, listening to the hero's final words, they knew one thing for certain. They were about to learn what it truly meant to survive. The soldiers sat in stunned silence, their minds racing with what the war hero had just revealed. No one had ever shared a story like that with them before. They had heard of dangerous battles, of wars fought across the stars, but nothing like this. Nothing could have prepared them for the brutal truth of the hero's world. They were used to facing danger, but what the hero described sounded like a nightmare. Every soldier in the room had known fear, but none of them had ever been in a fight like the one he was talking about. It wasn't just the enemies you could see. The true horror of the world he spoke of was the constant, ever-present danger, an environment designed to kill, where every moment could be your last. The hero could see the doubt in their eyes, the confusion as they tried to wrap their heads around what he was saying. He understood. How could they possibly comprehend the terror of a world so deadly, so unrelenting? But he had lived it. He had fought and survived. And now he was going to show them what it meant to truly fight for your life. He leaned forward, his eyes scanning the soldiers one by one. It wasn't just the creatures that made that world dangerous, he said, his voice low but powerful. It was everything. The environment itself wanted to kill you. The air was thick and toxic. The ground trembled, shifting constantly as if the planet itself was alive, trying to swallow you whole. The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. They had fought on planets where the conditions were harsh, planets with scorching heat, freezing cold and deadly storms, but nothing compared to what the hero described. No environment should be that hostile, that unforgiving. And yet, somehow, he had survived. The creatures were the worst, the hero continued, his voice growing darker. But they weren't the only threat. There were things that came at you from the shadows, things you couldn't see until they were right on top of you. I lost men to things that we still don't understand. We thought we had learned to survive, but the planet kept throwing surprises at us. There was always something new, something worse, waiting around the corner. The soldiers could feel the weight of his words. The hero wasn't just talking about physical enemies. He was talking about a world that seemed to have a mind of its own, a world that was constantly shifting, changing, and finding new ways to challenge you. They began to realize that surviving there wasn't just about being tough. It was about constantly adapting, never letting your guard down for even a moment. We had to be fast, the hero said, his voice sharp. Every second counted. If you weren't paying attention, if you weren't ready to react, you didn't last long. There was no time for hesitation. The creatures. They hunted in packs, attacking from all sides. The moment you heard their roar, it was already too late. You had to move, and you had to move fast. The soldiers listened intently, hanging on every word. They could picture the terrifying landscape of the planet. Sharp rocks jutting from the ground like teeth, dark forests full of unseen threats, and the sound of creatures lurking in the distance, waiting for their moment to strike. They could feel the tension building in the room as the hero painted the picture of a battle unlike anything they had ever known. And the worst part, the hero said, his voice barely a whisper, the worst part was the isolation. We were cut off from the rest of the galaxy. No reinforcements, no rescue. It was just us, stranded on a planet from hell, fighting for survival with nothing but our wits and our will to live. The room was completely still. The soldiers were all thinking the same thing. How could anyone survive under those conditions? How could anyone endure such terror and come out the other side alive? The hero's face grew hard as he spoke of the final battle. It wasn't just the creatures anymore. It wasn't just the land trying to kill us. We had to face our own fears, our own limits. We were pushed to the brink. There were times when I thought we wouldn't make it, times when it seemed like we were finished. But we didn't give up. We kept going. He paused for a moment, letting the silence settle in. The soldiers were listening so closely that it felt like the room itself had held its breath. "You're probably wondering why I'm telling you all this," the hero said, his eyes scanning the group. "Why I'm sharing my story with you. The answer is simple. You'll face battles like no other, and you'll need to understand what it means to truly fight. What it means to survive, no matter the cost. And I'm here to tell you, you can do it. You just have to remember that survival isn't about being the strongest. It's about being the smartest, the most determined. And you never, ever give up." The soldiers were silent for a long time after he finished speaking. They had come to learn how to fight and survive in the toughest conditions, but now they realized they had a lot to learn. The world the hero had come from had pushed him to his limits, but he had survived. And if he could survive that hell, they knew that with the right mindset, they could face anything. The hero had given them more than just a story. He had given them a lesson in survival, in strength, and in the power of never giving up, no matter how impossible the odds seemed. And they knew that they would carry those lessons with them when their own time came to face the darkness. The soldiers sat in silence, the weight of the hero's words hanging heavily in the air. Each of them felt a strange mix of awe and fear. They had heard war stories before, but none like this. This wasn't about strategic maneuvers or advanced weaponry. This was about survival in its purest, most primal form. The hero's world had taught him lessons that no one else could understand, lessons they were now being forced to face. The hero leaned back, his fingers tapping slowly on the table as if the memories were still fresh in his mind. It was clear that speaking about his past was no easy task for him. His eyes were distant, lost in the horrors he had lived through. It was as if the nightmares of that hellish world still haunted him, even after all this time. "The creatures we fought," he began, his voice low but steady. "They weren't just beasts. They were predators, born to hunt, born to kill. They had an intelligence that was far beyond anything we were prepared for. They learned, adapted, and became more dangerous the longer we stayed. At first, we thought we could outsmart them, but we were wrong." The soldiers exchanged glances, their minds racing with the implications of what the hero was saying. They had fought intelligent enemies before, aliens who were cunning and strategic. But these creatures, these predators, had a level of savagery that was almost unimaginable. "They didn't just attack in waves," the hero continued, his tone heavy. "They hunted us like we were prey. They knew when we were vulnerable, when we would make mistakes. They had no mercy. And no matter how much firepower we had, we couldn't stop them completely. Every time we thought we had gained the upper hand, they would strike back harder." The soldiers listened intently. This wasn't a simple battle between armies. This was a fight for survival against an enemy that seemed to understand their every move, an enemy that knew how to exploit their weaknesses. "We had to learn to fight smarter, not just harder," the hero said, his voice taking on a darker edge. "We couldn't rely on our weapons alone. The planet itself was just as deadly as the creatures. The storms, the shifting landscape, the constant danger, it was all designed to break you down. We had to adapt to the environment just as much as we had to adapt to the enemy. It was a constant battle, not just against the creatures, but against everything." The soldiers felt the chill of those words. The hero wasn't talking about a traditional battlefield. He was describing a nightmare, a place where the very ground beneath your feet could turn against you, where survival wasn't guaranteed no matter how skilled or prepared you were. "And then," the hero continued, his voice tightening, "came the moment that broke us. We were fighting on all fronts, against the creatures, against the environment, and against our own fear. But we thought we could make it. We thought we could push through because that's what soldiers do, right?" The soldiers nodded, each of them remembering their own moments of doubt, those times when the fight seemed impossible, when victory felt out of reach. It was easy to say you would fight until the end, but the hero had lived through it. He had fought in a war that seemed never ending, with no clear hope of winning. And yet, somehow, he had survived. But the final battle was unlike anything we had faced before, the hero said, his voice heavy with emotion. We thought we were prepared. We thought we knew how to fight. But in the end, the only thing that mattered was our will to survive. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the soldiers, as if weighing their reactions. We had reached a point where we knew we couldn't win. Not through strength, not through strategy. We had to rely on something else, something deeper. We had to fight for each other. We had to fight for the last piece of humanity in us. And that's when things started to change. The soldiers were on the edge of their seats now, hanging on every word. The hero's voice had shifted from one of grim reflection to something else, something filled with determination and strength. The idea of fighting for something greater than oneself was a powerful one. And the soldiers, hardened by their own battles, felt the truth of it resonate within them. In the end, we didn't win because we were the strongest, the hero said quietly. We won because we refused to give up. We fought, not because we were forced to, but because we had something to fight for. And when you fight for something worth dying for, something worth protecting, that's when the world starts to change. The room was quiet. The soldiers didn't know how to respond. They had heard stories of courage, of victories won against overwhelming odds. But this was different. This wasn't just about tactics or heroism. It was about survival in its rawest, most human form. And they knew that, no matter how tough they thought they were, they had a lot to learn from the hero. He had shown them that it wasn't just about the battle. It was about the mindset, the determination to keep going when everything around you was falling apart. And that, more than anything, was the most important lesson of all. The hero sat back, his story now complete, but the lessons he had shared would stay with the soldiers forever. The battle was never truly over. It was only just beginning. The soldiers sat in stunned silence, their minds struggling to process everything the hero had just told them. They had faced unimaginable enemies before, but what the veteran had described was something beyond their worst nightmares. The world he had fought on, the creatures he had battled, and the horrors he had survived. These weren't stories of distant galaxies or far-off worlds. They were tales from a reality so brutal that most of them couldn't even begin to fathom it. The hero's eyes remained distant, as if the memories still haunted him. The weight of those experiences lingered in his gaze, the unspoken trauma there for all to see. The soldiers were beginning to understand that this wasn't just a story of survival. This was a story of adaptation, of overcoming the unimaginable and transforming into something greater than the enemy. "Did you think it was over?" one of the younger soldiers asked quietly, breaking the heavy silence. "Did you think you could just leave once the fighting stopped?" The hero looked at him, a brief flicker of something like amusement crossing his face. "No, that's what I thought too. But this war didn't stop when the battles ended. It didn't stop when the last enemy fell. The war was in my head. It was in my soul. The creatures didn't just fight us. They broke us. And it wasn't until I learned to heal that I understood what had happened to me." The younger soldier, who had been eager to understand the veteran's strength, now felt a pang of fear. Was this what war did to a person? Did it break you beyond repair, leaving you only fragments of the person you once were? What happened when the war ended? Another soldier asked, her voice quiet but full of curiosity. "How did you survive after that?" The veteran stared into the distance, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the table as he took a deep breath. His mind seemed to be somewhere far away as he spoke again, the words slow and measured, like he was choosing each one carefully. "The war didn't truly end until I learned to stop fighting myself," he said quietly. "We were fighting to survive on a planet that wanted us dead. And then, when it was all over, I had to learn how to live again, to find something worth fighting for, not just surviving for." He paused and turned his gaze to the soldiers gathered around him. "The world we fought on, it was unlike anything you've ever seen. The creatures there didn't just fight. They lived for the hunt. They stalked their prey in ways you couldn't predict. And it wasn't just their strength that made them deadly. It was their ability to think, to adapt, to exploit your weaknesses. They didn't fight like soldiers. They fought like predators. The soldiers felt a chill run down their spines. They had been trained to fight against the best, against enemies who were relentless and clever. But these creatures, these predators, had an intelligence that went beyond strategy. They didn't follow any rules. They created their own. The creatures were relentless, the hero continued. They learned from every encounter, and they adapted faster than we could. They knew when to attack, when to retreat, and how to make us question our every move. It wasn't just about fighting them. It was about surviving them. One of the soldiers spoke up, his voice trembling slightly. How did you even fight back against something like that? It sounds impossible. The hero gave a grim smile. It was impossible. At first, but we learned. We had to. We became more than just soldiers. We became hunters, too. The room fell silent as the weight of his words sank in. The soldiers had always prided themselves on their training, their strength, their ability to fight. But what the hero was saying was something entirely different. In order to survive on that savage world, they couldn't just be fighters. They had to think like the enemy. They had to outsmart them. We couldn't rely on our weapons. Not all the time, the hero continued. We had to adapt to their environment, learn how to use the land against them. We had to be as unpredictable as they were. We set traps, ambushes, used the terrain to our advantage. It wasn't just about who had the biggest guns. It was about who had the mind to outthink their enemy. And trust me, those creatures were dangerous not just because of their strength. They were dangerous because they understood the art of war on a level we hadn't even considered. The soldiers were absorbing the gravity of the hero's words. They had always been taught to rely on firepower, strategy, and numbers, but now they were hearing a completely different perspective. What if survival wasn't just about fighting harder? What if it was about fighting smarter, thinking outside the box, using every advantage available to you, even when the odds were stacked against you? The hero leaned forward, his eyes now focused on each of the soldiers. The biggest lesson I learned on that world wasn't how to fight better. It was how to think differently. And that's something you all need to understand. The enemy you face won't always be the strongest. Sometimes it's the smartest that wins the war. The soldiers sat quietly, absorbing the lesson. The hero's past wasn't just a tale of brutal survival. It was a masterclass in how to fight, how to think, and how to adapt when faced with the most terrifying odds. And as they listened to his story, they realized that they too had much to learn, not just from the hero's victories, but from his struggles. The war on that savage world hadn't just broken the hero. It had reshaped him into something greater than he was before. A survivor, a strategist, a teacher. And now he was passing that knowledge on to them. The tension in the room was palpable. Each soldier sat at the edge of their seat, hanging on every word that came from the veteran's lips. His stories had shifted from mere survival to something far deeper, something they could all learn from. The veteran's eyes never left them, and his voice was steady, like a man who had been forged in the fires of an impossible war. You all think you know what it means to fight, the hero began, his voice calm but firm. You've been trained for it your entire lives. You know how to shoot, how to strategize, how to survive. But that's only part of it. What you need to understand, what I learned the hard way, is that real war isn't just about fighting the enemy. It's about understanding them, understanding what drives them, what makes them dangerous, and what makes them weak. The soldiers exchanged glances, their faces betraying a mix of confusion and curiosity. They had never considered war from this angle. They had always been told to think in terms of enemies to defeat, not minds to outwit. They thought their enemy's strength lay solely in their weapons, their numbers, or their power. But now the veteran was talking about something far more insidious, something they hadn't been prepared for. What's the most dangerous thing a soldier can face? The hero asked, his gaze piercing through each of them. A few soldiers hesitated before one responded. An enemy that's stronger than you. The veteran shook his head slowly. No, the most dangerous thing is an enemy that knows you better than you know yourself. The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. These creatures, these predators, they didn't fight like we did. They didn't just charge headfirst into battle. They fought, they adapted, and they always found a way to turn the tables. At first, we thought we could defeat them with our firepower, with our superior numbers. But that was a mistake. We couldn't fight their strength with our strength. We had to fight their minds with our minds. The soldiers were beginning to realize that the war the veteran had fought wasn't just about brute force. It was a battle of wits, a psychological struggle. And in that moment, they knew they weren't just learning how to fight. They were learning how to think. The veteran paused for a moment, letting the tension build, and then continued. In the early days, we tried everything we thought would work. We launched massive attacks, used our most advanced weapons, and yet, they adapted. They learned our tactics faster than we could come up with new ones. It wasn't until we started thinking differently that we had a chance. The younger soldiers leaned forward, their eyes wide. So what changed? One asked. The hero's lips curled into a faint, grim smile. We stopped fighting their war, and we started fighting ours. The veteran's words struck like a thunderclap. He was talking about a shift in mindset, a change in how they approached the enemy. The soldiers realized then that it wasn't just about matching the enemy's tactics, it was about creating new ones, ones they couldn't predict. They needed to outthink the enemy, surprise them, and always stay one step ahead. From that moment on, the veteran continued, we didn't play by their rules anymore. We started to set traps, use the environment to our advantage. We used guerrilla tactics, we hit fast, we hit hard, and we hit where they least expected it. The creatures didn't know what hit them. And that's when we started winning. The soldiers were hanging on every word. They had never considered war from this angle. It wasn't just about fighting. It was about thinking outside the box, about being unpredictable. The creatures on that savage world were smart, but the veteran had learned to outsmart them. And now, he was teaching the soldiers the most valuable lesson of all. It wasn't just about fighting the creatures. It was about learning to fight ourselves, the hero said, his voice lowering. We were too used to following orders, too used to doing what we were told. The creatures didn't care about orders or tactics. They were driven by pure survival. They used what was around them, and they adapted in ways we never thought possible. One of the soldiers raised a hand, his voice uncertain. How do we do that? How do we stop thinking like soldiers and start thinking like hunters? The hero smiled slightly. The first step is to stop being afraid of the unknown. When I landed on that planet, I was terrified. I didn't know anything about the creatures or how they fought. But over time I learned. I adapted. You have to do the same. You have to stop thinking like soldiers who follow orders. You need to think like hunters who track their prey and outsmart it. The room was dead silent, save for the steady breathing of the soldiers, each of them lost in thought. The weight of the hero's words wasn't just about survival. It was about learning how to see the world differently. It was about embracing the unknown and turning it into an advantage. The veteran's eyes scanned the room. War doesn't just break you. It reshapes you. And you have to decide, will you let it reshape you into something weaker, something afraid? Or will you let it reshape you into something stronger? As the words echoed in the room, the soldiers knew one thing for certain. They had much to learn. The veteran wasn't just a survivor, he was a master. And if they wanted to survive whatever the galaxy threw at them, they would have to follow his lead and learn to think like him. They weren't just learning how to fight. They were learning how to survive. And that meant learning how to outthink the enemy, adapt to their surroundings, and always stay one step ahead. The war was far from over, but now they had a chance to win it. And that chance came from understanding one simple truth. The real battle wasn't just about weapons or numbers. It was about who could think, adapt, and survive. And humanity would be ready. The room was thick with anticipation as the veteran leaned forward, his hands clasped together. The soldiers had heard many stories from him, but none as intense or as dangerous as the one he was about to tell. His eyes hardened, as though he was reliving a nightmare, but his voice remained steady, almost emotionless. "You want to know what it was like at the end of the war?" the veteran asked. His voice carried weight, drawing the attention of every soldier in the room. "You want to know what the final stand felt like? Then listen carefully, because this is where everything changed." The soldiers held their breath. They had been trained for every possible scenario, but they had never been prepared for the reality of facing an enemy as ruthless and relentless as the one the veteran had fought. The veteran paused, allowing the silence to stretch, making the soldiers feel every second. When the final battle came, we were outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded. There was no retreat, no reinforcements, no second chances. It was just us, alone in the heart of the enemy's stronghold. The veteran continued, his eyes growing distant. "We had been fighting for years, and I thought we had already seen the worst. But nothing could have prepared me for what was about to come." The soldiers were at the edge of their seats now. The tension in the room was unbearable. They had heard about victories, about clever tactics, but this was different. This was the true test of survival. "Imagine this," the hero said, his voice a little softer now, as though he was speaking to himself more than to the soldiers. "We had been fighting these creatures for so long that we knew everything about them. We knew their moves, their strengths, their weaknesses. But what we didn't know, what no one knew, was what they had learned about us." The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. They had never considered that the enemy could learn and adapt as quickly as they had. It was a chilling thought. If the enemy was evolving, they might already be one step ahead. We didn't realize it at the time, but the creatures had been watching us, studying us. They knew how we fought, how we thought, and by the time we reached their stronghold, they were ready for us. They had set traps, planned ambushes, and had prepared to use every weakness against us, the veteran said, his voice low. They had learned everything they needed to know, and they were waiting for us to make a mistake. The soldiers felt the weight of his words. Every battle they had fought up until that point had been preparing them for this one moment. The moment they would have to outthink the enemy one last time. But we weren't the same soldiers who had arrived on that planet all those years ago, the veteran said, the hint of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. We had learned too. We had adapted. And we weren't about to make the same mistakes again. He leaned in closer, his voice intense. We used everything we had. Every lesson we'd learned from the past. We set our own traps. We turned the environment against them. And when the final battle began, we didn't just fight to survive. We fought to win. We didn't just follow tactics. We wrote new ones. The soldiers were on the edge of their seats, their hearts racing. The tension in the room was palpable, and they could feel the weight of the veterans' experience bearing down on them. But it wasn't just our strategy that won the battle. It was our resolve, the veteran said, his voice growing even more intense. When we were surrounded, when everything seemed lost, we didn't give up. We fought harder, pushed further, and gave everything we had. And in the end, it was our determination to survive that broke them. The veteran took a deep breath, his eyes darkening. In the final moments, when the creatures were on the brink of victory, we made one last push. We broke through their defenses, forced them into retreat, and showed them the true power of humanity's will to survive. The room was silent for a moment as the soldiers processed what they had just heard. It was a story of loss, of struggle, but also of hope. Hope that humanity could adapt, overcome, and emerge victorious no matter the odds. The veteran's gaze softened slightly. You all need to understand one thing, he said, his voice calm now. In war, the greatest weapon isn't firepower. It's resolve. It's the ability to keep going when everything else tells you to stop. It's the will to survive, the strength to adapt, and the determination to win. That's what got us through." The soldiers sat in stunned silence. The veteran had taken them on a journey they would never forget. They had learned not only about tactics, but about what it truly meant to fight. It was more than just surviving the enemy. It was about surviving themselves. "We might have won that battle," the hero continued, "but the war didn't end that day. It goes on. You'll face your own battles, your own enemies, but remember what you've learned. Adapt, think, and most of all, never give up." The soldiers nodded, understanding the depth of the lesson. They had been prepared for battle, but now they were prepared for war. The real war, the war inside themselves. As the veterans' words sank in, they knew one thing for sure. Humanity would never back down, no matter the odds. The final stand had been won, but the journey was far from over. And humanity was ready for whatever came next. The veterans' words echoed in the minds of the soldiers long after the meeting ended. They had been shaken, inspired, and given a glimpse of what true courage and resilience meant. It wasn't just about the weapons or the battles. They had learned that the heart of war lay in something deeper. As the soldiers walked out of the room, they couldn't help but think about the final stand, about the sacrifices made, and the courage that had carried them through their darkest moments. They were different now. They had seen what it meant to fight with everything you had, to push beyond your limits and do what seemed impossible. They weren't just soldiers anymore. They were part of something much bigger, a legacy. The veteran, now alone in his quarters, sat quietly by the window, looking out over the galaxy that had once been his battlefield. His mind wandered back to the countless battles, the faces of fallen comrades, and the lives that had been lost. The war had ended, but the memories lingered. He had lived through the darkest days, seen horrors that many would never understand, but it had also shaped him. It had given him the strength to push forward when everything seemed lost. And now, in his final years, he knew that his legacy wasn't just about the battles he had fought. It was about the lessons he had passed on, the soldiers he had mentored, and the example he had set. The knowledge that in the face of overwhelming odds, humanity had stood tall, unbroken. The veteran took a deep breath, reflecting on the young soldiers he had trained. Their eyes, once filled with uncertainty, were now filled with resolve. They had learned, just as he had, that the deadliest weapon in any conflict wasn't the weapon in your hand. It was the strength of your spirit, the determination to stand firm, and the will to never surrender. A soft beeping from his console interrupted his thoughts. He turned, his expression unreadable. It was a message from an old ally, someone he hadn't heard from in years. The message was brief, but it carried weight. The war might have ended, but the galaxy was far from peaceful. New threats, new enemies, were always lurking in the shadows. As the message faded, the veteran stood up, a grim smile creeping onto his face. His time may have passed, but there would always be another generation ready to carry the torch forward. The human spirit had proven time and again that it could not be extinguished, no matter how fierce the enemy or how hopeless the situation seemed. His fingers hovered over the console for a moment, considering the options before him. The world had changed since his time on the battlefield, but one thing remained the same: humanity's resolve. The galaxy may have feared them before, but after the final stand, they would fear humanity even more. The veteran knew it was time to pass the torch. The warship might no longer be in the fight, but its legacy would continue through the soldiers who had learned from its example. The battles to come would not be fought with technology alone. They would be fought with the strength of will and the resolve to fight for what mattered. Humanity's legacy, forged in the fires of war, would never fade. He took one last look at the stars outside his window, knowing that his time had come. He had fought the hardest battles, but the next generation would fight their own, and they would remember the lessons learned from a world that had been on the brink, and yet had risen from the ashes. They would carry the legacy of the deadliest warship, of a humanity that had never known defeat, no matter the cost. As he turned to leave, he felt a sense of peace. The galaxy had been changed by their actions, and humanity's place among the stars had been secured. The deadliest warship may have been retired, but its story would never end. The soldiers who had learned from it would carry on its legacy, and the galaxy would remember that humanity, above all else, would always fight to survive. The veteran stepped away from the window, ready for whatever came next. He had done his part. Now it was time for the next generation to rise and prove that humanity's will to survive could never be broken, no matter what came next. And so, the final chapter of his story closed, but the legacy of humanity's deadliest warship continued, passing from one generation to the next, an unbroken chain of strength, courage, and resolve that would echo through the stars for all eternity.